All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started now. Thank you very much for joining today. Again, my name is Chris Rice with WXY. I know most of you very well at this point. We can go ahead to the next slide. Welcome to our sort of sixth advisory group meeting. This is our second opportunity to have all the advisory groups come together for discussion and feedback. So we're excited about this opportunity. So next slide. Just some Zoom reminders before we get into the agenda. So we'll have the chat open during the entire meeting. That's really for if folks want to comment and share comments that can be seen by the entire group, or if you're having any sort of technical challenges, please use the chat to let us know. When we get to the Q&A portions of the discussion, we're going to ask folks to use the raise the hand function to sort of queue up, and then we'll ask folks to unmute to speak. We'll have closed captioning available as well by clicking the CC down in the middle of the screen. And then we're also using the Q&A feature today. So we're going to ask folks if you have specific questions. There'll obviously be an opportunity to come off of mute and ask a question sort of live to the group. But if you'd also like to ask questions during the presentations, please submit those questions to the Q&A feature, and the team will be responding to as many of those as we can. So we'll go to the next slide. Also, just want to remind folks that we have invited all of the task force members to listen in and so they can hear the conversation firsthand. So you may see those folks online as well. So for today's meeting, the real goal here is to sort of review and discuss the project commitments for the vision plan and the guiding principles. So we're going to go through section by section. We'll discuss the Port and Blue Highway, the mixed use districts, the site systems, workforce development and access to jobs, and then governance and financing. We'll be stopping at specific points for Q&A and discussion. So please, again, use the Q&A feature during the presentation or write your questions down. We'll only be taking questions during those dedicated points throughout the meeting. Then we'll talk through environmental review, governance and timeline, and then close with next steps. And today, in terms of presenters, we'll be hearing from Jennifer Sun from EDC and also Mikkel Adgate from EDC. And there'll be additional folks supporting on the discussion. So we'll have David Lowen, Seth Ullman, Matt Furlong, and Brooke Wazorek as well. Next slide. Just a few guidelines before we get into the presentation. And it's totally okay if folks are off camera as well. But there, as I said, there'll be dedicated time for Q&A following specific sections of the vision plan. We're asking folks to please keep your questions and comments sort of targeted to the topic that we're discussing. The project team will address questions from participants and also respond to questions submitted to the questions channel, as I described. And then when we do get to those specific breaks, we're going to ask folks again to raise your hand virtually using the raise your hand feature. And just a reminder, folks, please be respectful, address all the participants, both the presenters and other attendees with respect. We really want to ask folks to ask clear and concise questions. We want to answer as many questions and answer in a meaningful way. So we're going to ask folks to avoid sort of longer statements and drawn out statements, but try to ask clear and concise questions as best you can. And then understand that we have a lot of stakeholders on the call. There's a lot to discuss and time is limited, so we may not get to every question that is raised today. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Jennifer Sun from EDC to get us started.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We wanted to start by first presenting the site plan as we are today. There are no changes to the site plan itself and how we're thinking about the districts within BMT as a part of the future development. So just to quickly recap, we have defined the overall site in terms of distinct districts, including BMT North, Atlantic Basin, and BMT South, which would support mixed-use development, a combination of permanently affordable housing with a minimum commitment of 35% of permanently affordable housing and a goal of achieving 40% affordability across the site, as well as delivering a combination of affordable industrial space, commercial and retail space, open spaces that are connected by a new greenway, and that is also overall supporting a modern all-electric port. What we'll spend most of today's presentation and discussion on is really presenting where we are with respect to the vision plan's guiding principles and commitments, reflecting a lot of input from the task force. So with that, let's move to the next slide. So before we go into the guiding principles and commitments for each section, we did want to take a moment to explain what the task force is actually voting on, because we wanted to acknowledge that there have been a lot of questions from task force members, but also advisory group and public about what the materials will actually be. So what we've proposed to the task force is that on June 18th, we will be presenting or actually providing a final vision plan document. And so this is a very lengthy and detailed Word document that describes a combination of guiding principles, which is another way of saying project goals and desired outcomes that will guide future decision-making with the BMT Development Corporation, the new governance body that will be responsible for providing oversight of how the future BMT redevelopment is implemented and delivers the commitments that are included in that vision plan. It also describes the strategies for achieving those project goals, and then the commitments for advancing both the city's policy goals and delivering community benefits. In addition to this Word document, which we have shared with the task force and that they're actively providing edits and refinements to, we have also shared the development framework site plan. So in the pre-read materials yesterday, you should have seen towards the back of this presentation, a series of slides pulled from previous task force meetings and advisory group meetings that provide a visual illustration of the geography and the districts that we are describing, as well as the massing alternatives in BMT North, Atlantic Basin, and BMT South that will be further refined in the next phase. So this is really intended to show both the mixed-use program, the potential ground floor uses, as well as the foundational infrastructure investments that will be made in order to create the physical conditions to support mixed-use development at BMT. As I mentioned, there will be a lot of refinement of that site plan and the land use program in the next phase, where a BMT advisory task force that could include task force members would continue to work with EDC and the consultant team in translating that work into design guidelines that are then attached to the general project plan and introduced into the GPP process for further public comment in parallel with an environmental review process that would start shortly after the task force vote. As I've alluded to a little bit, what happens after the task force vote is that we would then, if the task force votes affirmatively, take the next steps to start the GPP process with environmental review and an ESD administered GPP process with public engagement along the way. And we will show a timeline at the end that shows sort of the key milestones for public engagement and what that timeline would be. So with that, I'm going to transition then into talking about the guiding principles and commitments for each of the major sections of our vision plan, starting with the port. Now, my intention is not to read all of the text on these slides. What I'll try to do is sort of highlight the most important points that we've heard in recent conversations with the task force of what they've emphasized to make sure is included in the vision plan document. So for example, with the port, there has been a lot of task force feedback about really emphasizing that we are planning for a modern, flexible, and all-electric port of the future that in particular supports a citywide Blue Highway service. Next slide. In the commitments, we have acknowledged both the funding that has been committed already from the federal government, state government, and city government towards modernizing this port, as well as a commitment to continuing to pursue additional grant opportunities and other public funding in the future to help offset the significant costs of pure infrastructure for modernizing a port. Next slide. And so here we talk about, for example, with respect to phasing, that we are making a commitment to constructing the new marginal pier, but also delivering a standalone industrial building in Atlantic Basin, as well as housing and BMT North as potentially the first phase of the overall project. And that we would use the USDOT federal grant with the city capital local match of almost $110 million, plus proceeds from the BMT North housing development to help fund and begin construction of the new marginal pier. As we've talked about before, we would also release an RFP for a future port operator to attract private investment into the topside infrastructure of this modern port. Next slide. Then Blue Highways is an important component of this modern port. And so in response to task force feedback, we've elaborated on the guiding principle being not only that we establish a Blue Highway network, but are explicit about the positive benefits that we want to achieve as a result of investing in this initiative, specifically reducing truck usage on roadways and really using a Blue Highway service to move construction materials to BMT to support its redevelopment and ship demolition materials out by water to minimize the truck impacts during its construction. Next slide. There's a lot of commitments here that have not changed in terms of how we're thinking about moving the planning, infrastructure planning of other sites in Manhattan and in the Bronx to begin to create the citywide network in addition to BMT. In response to task force feedback, we've added some more details about, where possible, the amount of city capital that has been committed to support the activation of other sites, as well as other actions that we can take, including putting RFPs out to secure private partnerships, working with the city, specifically EDC and DOT, into the future in activating additional Blue Highway landings. So for example, we've added some more detail about downtown Skyport receiving $10 million in city capital to activate that as one of the more short-term Blue Highway landings in addition to BMT. We've also noted the $28 million initial city capital commitment to prepare the waterfront for Blue Highway infrastructure at the former prison barge location in Hunts Point. We've also noted that for the two Brooklyn locations in Sunset Park at 23rd Street and 29th Street, we have the opportunity to put an RFP out for 23rd Street as soon as the end of this year for an operator to activate that site and invest in its activation for Blue Highway. And then for 29th Street, that we could put an RFP out in 2029 after the existing lease expires. Next slide. Some additional commitments are to continue to work with Senator Gounardes and other electeds in putting a study forward that looks at tax incentive programs as well as other policy interventions and incentives to encourage activation and utilization of Blue Highway by private shippers for freight deliveries. And that we will continue to study the feasibility of expanding this Blue Highway network to not only include the Bronx and Manhattan, but other boroughs as well, so that ideally we have Blue Highway landings in all 5 boroughs as a result of our combined efforts. Next slide. So I'll pause there to see if there's any questions about the guiding principles or the commitments for ports and Blue Highway.
Thanks very much, Jen. And just want to remind folks to please use the raise your hand function to queue up. And additionally, because we have a lot of folks on the call, we're going to ask folks to ask one question at a time. And again, remind folks to ask clear and concise questions as best as possible. If folks have multiple questions, we can come back to you time allowing. And we'll start with Hunter.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'll try to be concise. I am multitasking a little bit during this presentation, but Jennifer, you mentioned the upland infrastructure for the Blue Highways program, which is definitely an interest of ours. Did you share a map specifically showing that infrastructure that would be required for to accommodate the Blue Highway program?
No, we don't have a map. If you're asking about like what the Blue Highway infrastructure would be at
Yeah,
each of the landings that we're planning for, we don't have a map that shows that because that infrastructure planning work is at a very early stage right now. So we do have consultants on board who are working closely with our asset management team and
mhm,
doing a lot of site due diligence and investigations to understand how much upland area there is. And with that consideration, as well as the condition of the bulkheads, put forward a plan for the type of cargo that could be received at each landing, because depending on I think the size of the waterfront area, the upland area, that can really, inform whether that landing is receiving micro freight or containers, for example, or both. So it can really vary depending on site conditions. But
okay.
as we move that study forward and that work advances, one of the things actually you're reminding me of as a new commitment is that we will be forming an advisory council of maritime stakeholders to work more methodically in a way to advance this Blue Highway planning. So there could be opportunities for other stakeholders to have more visibility of how each of those landings is evolving.
I have one more follow-up question, if that's all right.
Mhm.
Um, do you in the vision, is there kind of a proportion of like a vision to have, X number of deliveries freight happening by micromobility versus, trucks? I'm just curious if there's like a vision to move this in a hopefully better, cleaner, less environmental impact, neighborhood
Well,
impact direction.
that's that's the overall goal, right? Is that ideally the Blue Highway service is all electric, meaning from vessels to the trucks, vans, and micro distribution vehicles, so that on the supply chain, all of that is electrified. So that is the long-term vision. And we're working with industry stakeholders to help support that, from engaging with vessel owners in thinking about how to support their R&D to design all electric barges, tugs, and boats, for example. Um, and then we're not setting, let's say, targets for like the volume that would be handled at each location or the amount of truck trips that would be reduced at this stage, because again, it's too early. We still need a lot more industry input on how each of those landings would be utilized, the amount of cargo throughput that could reasonably be accommodated. And I think maybe what you might be sensitive about, just recognizing your group's advocacy around the
Yeah.
Greenway, a real focal point of this Blue Highway planning is in those upland areas, how do we both support Blue Highway freight movement and last mile deliveries, but in a way that does not conflict with Greenway users? And so that is going to be a real focal point of planning with EDC, DOT, and the industry, and thinking about design solutions and operational solutions that can accommodate those different needs.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Hunter. Other folks have questions. Catherine, go ahead, please.
The Q&A too, but I'm just wondering about the community priority fund. I assume that's like what we talked about in our last AG session, the cruise fund, the anticipated $250,000 a year. And I know people had asked in the last meeting about the structure of that and more details. So just wondering if you could give an update.
Got it. So the question here is about this bullet on slide 9, leverage agreements with cruise lines to support community priorities through the Community Priority Fund, and the ask is for additional detail on that specific piece.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Catherine. Hi, everyone. This is Mikkel from the EDC team. Yes, that question is in reference to the cruise fund that we have been negotiating, if you remember, over a year ago with the cruise companies coming into the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal. Until the logistics on how those funds are going to be dispersed are in active communication with Councilmember Aviles. If you remember, she passed cruise-related legislation last year, and so we've been talking with her office about how exactly those funds will be dispersed. So no details to share just yet, but know that there's active conversation on the final rollout.
Thank you. And can you just confirm, I think you said this in the last meeting, but I don't have it written down. The accruals for the fund start January 1st, 2025. So they've already started accruing.
It varies based on the operator when the agreement was signed. So it varies per operator. So we may need to follow up with you on the exact date. But there is, just because they each signed at different timelines, so they're not all starting from January. And then one slight correction in terms of what we begin to estimate. The Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, we think will be about 400,000 annually based on the dollar per passenger collected.
Thank you, Mikkel. I think I saw Arif's hand up briefly. I wanted to see Arif if you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if you had a dollar amount or a percentage of the funding that's going to be allocated from housing to revitalizing the marginal pier.
Well, so the marginal pier is currently estimated to cost about 1.25 billion. We have a combined total of about $274 million, both from the US DOT mega grant and the local match, to help offset some of that cost. In addition to some city capital, I think of about $80 million that can also go towards Pier 10 repairs. So the remaining balance then would essentially be funded through housing development.
Okay, gotcha. And I'm not quick at math. Do you have that number?
I don't have it off the top of my head either.
Okay. Is that something you guys can share post meeting? Just so we have an idea of how much we're expected to raise through housing.
Yep.
Thank you.
So Arif, other questions or comments on the Port or Blue Highways? Okay, not seeing any hands. I think we can move on to the mixed use districts portion.
Okay.
My hand is up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, I couldn't see you. Carolina, go ahead.
Okay, hang on, I'm trying to get the camera back on. Yeah, so I don't want to ask a question, I just want to make a statement. In that I think task force members really need to vote no on the basis of the maritime planning process and its proposals. There's an intense need for maritime space for the full diversity of the maritime ecosystem in this port, and that's more than, so we need more than a container port and a few berths for Marine Highway. And the way the EDC's approached this, you're not using the right people to assess the maritime needs, so you've hired consultants and new EDC staff with container port backgrounds. So that's not brown water, meaning tugs, barges, ferries, tour, dinner boats, historic educational vessels. All of them need home port space to pick up passengers, vessel support services for repair. A concept that Portside proposed, which is actually baked into the city's waterfront revitalization program, the WRP from the Department of City Planning. Which, and actually everything you're proposing does not align with the city's own plans in that waterfront revitalization program. I want to say that out loud so people who aren't in maritime know that there actually is a city document, there's a city policy, and it calls out actually referring to it as a road container port before the rebranding as BMT as essential, and that SMIAs, significant maritime industrial areas, need to be kept as that. And so this process is not doing that. I can talk more about this, but I said, I know there's a time limit, but I'm just gonna say what you're proposing doesn't fit policy and what the maritime community knows. And the process has been very flawed in many ways. But for example, I think last night you all sent the DOT mega grant, but I asked for that on February 11th. So I haven't had time to look at that. I was at Borough Hall at Reynoso's event last night. And so I'm getting that information, if that's what it is, too late to actually have put in comments as an advisory group member in the discussion about the marginal pier. And so you all have generally, not only to me, but other people, not provided requested information that's reasonable to request, and you've barreled ahead on this kind of proposal. Now, the last thing I'll say right now is you yourselves are referring this as a generational opportunity, and they're not planned in this period of time. So the city's revitalization of the Brooklyn Navy Yard ongoing has taken decades, and Andrew Kimball knows that because he was the president of the Navy Yard 2 jobs ago. So this time frame makes no sense for maritime or anything else for a site of this physical size and its complexity. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing how you feel, Carolina. I want to see if Mikhail or Jennifer wants to respond at all before we move on.
Yeah, I obviously, Carolina, appreciate your comments and the amount of time that all of the advisory group members have given to this planning process, and totally hear you on challenges from the process side. I think where we disagree in terms of a policy perspective is that from a waterfront revitalization program perspective, the amount of investment that we're talking about here at Brooklyn Marine Terminal, in addition to the work on the Howland Hook side, to us feels like a significant step forward on revitalizing the waterfront, with many of the commitments that Jennifer Sun laid out, particularly moving the ball forward on Blue Highway. So I know that we're coming at this from different perspectives, but wanted to explain our thinking from a waterfront perspective.
Am I allowed a response?
No, we're going to move on to the next section. If we have time later, we can come back to it. So I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer.
Thanks. I think what I'll add, also just in brief response to Carolina's remarks, is one about the US DOT mega grant application. I believe you did receive most of the grant application, and what we more recently provided was a lot of the detailed backup and supporting documentation for the information that was presented in the general project application. So, I think we've been very transparent about sharing the grant application, the scope of the activities that were proposed and that have been funded by US DOT. And then secondly, in terms of our engagement with the maritime industry and exploring a full range of opportunities for supporting additional maritime uses at BMT, in addition to a container port and Blue Highway, is that we have many, channels at EDC through asset management's Port NYC program, frequent outreach through our port's waterfront transportation team, who are very active in Sunset Park. They're in constant communication with maritime stakeholders across the city. And through that active engagement, we are not hearing a clamor for, more types of other like berthing uses at BMT. So, we believe that what we have put forward in our port plan is actually reflective of not only port planning consultant input, but also input from maritime stakeholders, locally, regionally, who really are responsible for making decisions about where they locate their businesses in the city. So with that, I'll transition into the mixed-use districts. So similar format, I'm going to just briefly highlight some key guiding principles and commitments here, but I think this table summarizes some of the most important points of agreement that we've reached with the task force, both from an urban design perspective and also in terms of the affordable housing that we're delivering through this plan. So again, what's summarized here are the 3 mixed-use districts: BMT North, Atlantic Basin, and BMT South, which is the UPS-owned site. What we have also shown here is within BMT North is making a distinction between the upland area of Pier 7 and then the area between Congress and DeGraw Street, because we've received task force feedback that treats those sort of two subject districts in distinct ways. Together in BMT North, as well as the other districts, we are committing to a minimum of 35% permanently affordable units. What is also new is a commitment to an aspirational goal of increasing that overall affordability up to 40% across the BMT site. Should we receive additional funds in the future that both plug the current project gap of approximately $370 million, and then once the project is fully funded, if there are excess revenues beyond that, we are committing to those excess revenues being prioritized to reach that additional affordability from 35% to 40%, which would deliver almost 4,000 units, permanently affordable units at BMT. Then we also have included a few urban design parameters that have been established with task force input. So for example, the maximum building height has been an important development control that we've already established at this phase. So in BMT North, for example, in the Pier 7 upland area, responding to task force feedback, we are concentrating taller buildings at Pier 7 because of its proximity to the open space to 425 feet. Whereas in the rest of BMT North, it is at a lower scale of 325 feet maximum. We are also committing to delivering 17 acres of public open space through a combination of Pier 7 open space and a neighborhood park, almost 2 acres in size at the corner of DeGraw and Columbia Street, as well as discounted industrial space to make sure that it's affordable to future industrial tenants, as well as commercial space that can support more neighborhood retail and services and community facility space, including a school. And then you'll see similar commitments in Atlantic Basin and BMT South, both in terms of also delivering a minimum of 35% affordability with a goal of 40%, as well as maximum building heights of 325 feet in Atlantic Basin and 385 feet in BMT South, and then the corresponding open space commitments as well as the mixed use program. The difference here that I would call out is that in Atlantic Basin, we're also proposing a hotel be developed there to help support cruise passengers staying more days in Red Hook to support local businesses and to reflect task force input rather than specifying that this is a 400 key hotel. Instead, we recognize it could be up to 400 keys, but potentially vary as we advance the planning process. Next slide. So in the guiding principles, we reflected a lot of the task force input and how we think about creating a pedestrian first neighborhood that really prioritizes safe pedestrian connections within this new mixed use neighborhood, as well as open space, creating publicly accessible waterfront space, integrating resiliency into that new open space and into the site throughout to provide a higher level of flood protection for future and existing residents, and then some urban design considerations about how to create a very pedestrian-oriented experience with stronger connections to the existing neighborhoods. Next slide. The commitments are what I've described, that are consistent with the guiding principles of delivering open space, publicly accessible waterfront access, as well as on the ground floor of these mixed-use buildings, we are committing to creating 55,000 square feet of flexible light industrial space that would be rented at a discount of 25% off of the appraised market rent. The kinds of light industrial uses that we would permit here that is co-located with residential would conform to what's been established in the Gowanus Mixed Use Special District, where through that Gowanus neighborhood rezoning, DCP with input from stakeholders as well as DEP has defined a wide range of light industrial uses that are that can be co-located with residential because they don't have toxic air emissions or other kinds of impacts. Next slide. A lot of the same guiding principles would apply here in Atlantic Basin in terms of really supporting active ground floor uses, affordable light industrial space, and also creating a public open space and waterfront access, including around a redeveloped Brooklyn Cruise Terminal. Next slide. A lot of the similar commitments here, including but distinctly in Atlantic Basin, we are creating a 170,000 square foot standalone light industrial building. We'll actually be updating this commitment to acknowledge that it might not be limited to light industrial uses only, but also heavier industrial uses because it is a standalone facility rather than being on the ground floor of mixed use buildings to increase the range of industrial uses that could be supported in this distinct building. In this standalone industrial building, we're also committing that 50% of that space would be managed by a nonprofit experienced operator to really ensure that it remains industrial in use and affordable in the long term. And then the rest of this space would be prioritized for maritime uses. And then we would also prioritize outreach to Red Hook-based industrial companies to make sure that they're aware of that opportunity and future leasing, as well as available incentive programs. We are also committing to public waterfront access, open space, and of course, the affordability goals as well. Next slide. At BMT South, or the UPS site, what we're envisioning here is also a mixed-use program, new open space, resiliency measures being integrated into that open space and in the site elevation, as well as the UPS site also delivering at least 35% affordability with a goal of 40% permanently affordable units at BMT South. Next slide. Some specific commitments to the UPS site or BMT South is the creation of a 50,000 square feet industrial building that's also standalone that could also support a range of light industrial or heavier industrial uses. Additionally, EDC is committing up to $30 million for the design and fit out of that industrial building, and then reserving that space to be leased and managed in the long term by a nonprofit operator. Again, to ensure its industrial use and its affordability into the future. We are also proposing a cultural facility and a commitment of $30 million to support a cultural destination that's integrated with a newly created open space. Next slide. Then transitioning from the mixed use program to talk about housing. So guiding principles have really emphasized the opportunity of advancing fair housing and environmental justice goals of creating opportunities for lower income families to have access to modern, quality, affordable housing throughout the BMT site. And also for us to take a comprehensive approach in delivering a range of housing types, including family size units and affordability levels, while also investing in offsite affordable housing preservation and creation in Community Board 6, as well as directly investing in NYCHA Red Hook houses. Next slide. So some of the specific commitments here, in addition to the overall affordability goals, a minimum of 35%, up to 40%, should there be additional future proceeds that can support that additional affordability, is also committing to 200 units of the permanently affordable housing units that are created at BMT being reserved specifically for NYCHA Red Hook houses residents. So this is different and a significant step forward from where we were before, when these 200 units of affordable units were being reserved for NYCHA residents citywide. So based on further conversations with NYCHA, we are now able to commit to those units being available specifically for Red Hook Houses residents and making rental a subsidy available as well if it's necessary in order to ensure that they have real access to that affordable housing at BMT. We are also committing to reserving a portion of that BMT housing for family size units, which are between 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms. And we're in active conversations with task force members and with HPD about the possibility of specifying a minimum number or percentage of BMT housing to be set aside as family size units as a part of this plan. Next slide. We're also committing to establishing a $50 million fund to support off-site preservation and creation of affordable housing within CB6. And a notable step forward from where we were before is that rather than waiting for proceeds from BMT North Housing to help fund this $50 million commitment, we're making this commitment post-GBP. We're doing the same for the $200 million that we're committing to NYCHA Red Hook Houses, recognizing that the capital improvements will cost far more than $200 million, but this commitment is to really help begin to accelerate the campus improvements at NYCHA with this funding from BMT, also upon GPP approval. Next slide. I already touched upon a lot of the light industrial commitments, but I'll highlight a few others in the next slide. But what's really been important as an overall policy goal is for us through BMT to deliver modern, climate resilient, and affordable industrial space at BMT in a way that doesn't really exist in the neighborhood today. And so in addition to creating 55,000 square feet of affordable space as a part of the mixed use program. Again, we're also delivering 2 standalone industrial buildings, one at Atlantic Basin, another at the UPS site, both of which would be managed by a nonprofit operator with significantly discounted rents and capital funding support for the design and fit out of that space. Additionally, we're also creating a $10 million industrial development fund, 50% of which would be made available in the form of grants, 50% of which would be through loans and IDA benefits to support industrial businesses offsite to be able to tap into that fund to support acquisition of buildings and or equipment and other capital investments. We're also committing to a framework for ongoing reporting of the economic development and economic impact of leasing those industrial spaces to companies in the future so that we can see what the benefits are from industrial space modernization at BMT. And we're also preserving at the Brooklyn Wholesale Meat Market that facility and that site being preserved as industrial space, as well as 22 acres on the 65th Street Rail Yard adjacent to BAT, remaining industrial as well. Next slide. Then moving into the community and cultural space. So a guiding principle has been creating a wide range of community and cultural spaces, including a school at BMT North for the new population and creating a new cultural destination at BMT South to support Red Hook. Next slide. So overall, we're creating 285,000 square feet of community and cultural space. As I've noted, the proposal is to create a school in BMT North. We are having active conversations with SCA on the future planning of that school and its specific location. We are also designing community facility space to be available throughout the BMT site to support community events, meetings, and cultural events and other uses. And then for the cultural destination that we're creating at BMT South, we're committing $30 million towards the design and fit out of that space. And then also importantly, committing $17 million in capital towards the creation of a BMT Welcome and Experiential Learning Center that's focused on Blue Highway careers and really creating accessible pathways for Red Hook and other residents to access the jobs that are created. Next slide. So we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great. Yes. Before you do, just some quick reminders again, asking folks to ask focused and concise questions so that we can hear from a range of folks on the call, and asking folks to ask one question at a time. Also wanted to flag, Catherine, I see you've raised a number of questions around the Development Corporation and commitment tracking. We'll be covering that later in the presentation, so we will be coming to that. So yes, John, what is your specific question or comment?
I mean, there's so many. I hate to even get into the housing thing because the whole premise, like I was looking last night at Carolina said that you guys finally released the thing. The whole mega grant is only for peers 9A and 9B to make those. So like this got expanded. I don't know whose great idea that was or whatever. And I don't know who didn't do the math properly. And I was supposed to trust you with all this math that didn't figure out that you needed a lot more money to do what you wanted to do. Who accepted this deal and let the Port Authority off the hook. But okay, let's get to the housing. That 250 million, like you've said yourself, is not enough. This project is going to displace a lot of people in this area. It just does eventually throughout the years. So a one-time payment is not really going to do it. Is there any way to do something like what was done in Battery Park City where it continuously keeps paying? I've done the math, and just like, I don't know, because you guys never released a number on what these condos are going to go for, which I can't even imagine what it's going to go for, right? But let's just say rentals. Let's say 7,000 rentals at 5,000, very conservative number. It's going to be a lot more than 5,000 a month for market rate, right? But let's say 5,000, that's like $35 million a month. A month. So like, can't there be a continuous fund that this project would pay into? And I say, like I say, I don't even think that we should be talking this because you guys know how I feel about paying for infrastructure and all of this. But if we're going to entertain the housing question, could be a continuous fund that keeps paying for the people that are continuously going to be displaced because of a project like this.
So I think to your first question about the mega grant, when we applied for the mega grant, it was before EDC even had management control of the site, and we had very limited information about the conditions of the piers. And we hadn't done any outreach with port operators about designing the marginal pier. So with that limited information,
Well, who makes a deal like that then? Who
we
makes a
did
deal
our
like that?
best.
Who just blindly goes into a deal? Like, that's like buying a house without appraising it or anything. Like,
John,
you want us to trust you. Excuse me, Chris. You want us to trust you, right? And who makes a deal and just goes in and just doesn't know what they're facing? I don't believe that. I just don't. I think you guys are smarter than that. Like, how can we believe that?
heard on your point.
The last thing that I'll say about the mega grant is that it's the largest grant that EDC has received in its history. So even though it seems small, and I understand that given the scale of costs for the marginal pier, I just want people to understand it is a significant grant from the federal government to receive $164 million. Moreover, we applied for 2 other grants. So we didn't just stop there. Our goal had been to try to raise as much capital funding through different pots as possible. So we had applied for USDOT mega grant. We had also applied for the PIDP program, which people have asked about. And we also applied for a Clean Ports EPA grant. So we didn't get 2 of the grants, but we got 1 of them. And so that's an important start. And as we are committing to, we will continue to pursue new grant opportunities should they become available. And that it can include PIDP or other funding opportunities into the future. In terms of what the housing is paying for, so the housing proceeds, the combination of condos, market rate rentals, are generating cross subsidy to pay for pier infrastructure, public infrastructure like a flood wall, the new greenway, the open space. So those are one-time costs, but it's also funding a capital reserve fund for the ongoing maintenance of those piers so that we don't repeat the mistake of the Port Authority, where we invest initially in modern infrastructure, but then don't have the funds to be able to continue to maintain those piers in good condition. And we're also funding through those housing proceeds an open space maintenance fund as well. So we're trying to be responsible financial stewards in the ongoing M&O of this site to ensure that the quality of the community benefits that we're delivering are maintained over time. And then,
Well,
and then in terms of displacement, So that's why we've been working really hard at finding ways to increase the overall affordability in terms of how many permanently affordable units we can deliver here, as well as supporting offsite preservation. So that's
doesn't help the people
thinkable
that
as
are
a
already
way
in this
of
area.
minimizing the displacement effect is also supporting preservation offsite, not only for future residents, but for current residents.
Well,
So
how
we-
about a continuous displacement fund? Because that's not just a one-time thing. As this neighborhood turns into whatever you guys are going to turn it into, people are going to continuously get displaced. So how about a continuing fund for that?
We've got a number of other folks that have hands up, so we're going to go to the next participant. So Arif, and then we'll go to Carolina.
Thank you. So my question is, would we be able to increase the number of affordable housing units if we allocated less money to financing the port? And you know, I just want to say I understand the regional significance of the port and appreciate the economic, social, and environmental benefits. But it just seems like these costs of this regional project are falling on the local, you know, community, and I think there needs to be some sort of clear benefit, you know, for the local residents and the local community. And for me, that's affordable housing. And I don't necessarily think that should be limited in favor of financing a regional project.
So
That should, in my opinion, those costs should be bared by, you know, the entire city.
And the city is contributing city capital towards the modernization of that container port and the Blue Highway Pier. So the marginal pier is not being funded only by the US DOT grant, but also $110 million of a local match in city capital, plus the city capital that was pledged at the announcement of BMT last year for Pier 10 repairs. So there is a significant contribution from the city already towards those marginal pier costs. There is a local benefit to investing in that container port's growth and Blue Highway in terms of the potential to create more jobs. And these are family sustaining wage jobs that we would be working with local workforce providers to make sure there are real pathways to for local residents. So it's not only, you know, housing that is a local benefit, but also jobs.
Okay,
Thank you.
I get that. And sorry, Chris, just quick follow-up. So, but just back to my original question, would we be able to increase the amount of affordable units if we weren't allocating housing funding to financing the ports?
Technically, yes, just, you know, in terms of
Okay.
math, straight up math, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Arif. Yes, Carolina, your specific comment or question.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on John's comment about funding. I feel like the city, EDC, someone is making choices here, and I don't accept this framework. So, for example, the mayor recently announced $402 million to improve Fifth Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. Now, it may need improvement, but that's an awful lot of money for basically an area of high-end shops. And so money like that, I think, should be directed someplace like this. There was also a choice by the city in supporting the Port Authority's construction of the new bus terminal with up to $2 billion of tax revenue for Midtown buildings over 40 years. So why isn't money like that directed to this? So I think what's happening here is this local area is being asked to bear the impacts of a proposal. Well, we're sort of being asked to solve a lot of problems all at once. Like we're solving a container port, we're adding a marine highway, but then we have to solve the city's housing crisis and a number of these things. And the city does not seem to have that's not chosen to allocate money here because it feels like it's a predetermined thing. You actually want to add housing. And I'm going to now push back verbally on what Jennifer Sun said to me by way of rebuttal. I put it in the comments. There is an acute need for maritime space in this harbor. So either if you don't know it, you're not, I don't know who you're talking to, happy to connect you to people, but it's known, it's a given, and the maritime ecosystem is diverse. And you could fill up this place with all berthing and repair and support services and maritime support services hubs and everything else. So it is absolutely false that there's not a need for maritime space beyond the container port.
Thank you, Carolina. We'll go to Jacqueline next.
Good afternoon. I have a question regarding housing and jobs that are expected to come in. Guess, do you have an exact number of like low-income families housing that will be affected? And then does that number equate to the number of housing and job opportunities, pathways for careers that you all are saying is a priority?
To
35, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Jennifer.
No, so I was just going to break down what we mean when we talk about 35% affordability across the site. That translates into 2,695 units for families who have an AMI between 40% and 100% AMI. So that's what that would mean. And if we are at 40% of affordability, which is our goal, if we have more proceeds that can support that additional affordable housing, that would translate into 3,080 units of affordable housing that's permanently affordable at BMT. We're going to have a workforce section shortly where we can talk more about the types of programs and partnerships with local organizations that we would be investing in to make sure that the new jobs are accessible to local residents.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Jen. Right, not seeing any other hands, I think we can move on to the site systems.
So site systems is another way of talking about key infrastructure that's necessary in order to create the conditions to support both the growth of the port and also the mixed-use program at BMT. So some of the key guiding principles for our circulation and transit plan at BMT is to really center the district as being pedestrian-oriented, making sure that we're establishing connections between the existing neighborhoods and the new BMT site, especially through safer pedestrian and bicycle connections. Also designing site circulation with the goal of minimizing additional traffic effects on local streets. So we've spent a lot of time with the task force looking at ways of potentially moving the truck route from where they are today on Van Brunt and Columbia Street to, under one option, moving it to the BMT site as a way of moving that truck traffic off of local streets, and then creating opportunities of really increasing transit service and access. So some key strategies in our circulation and transportation plan to increase mobility and transit access while also reducing private car ownership and usage is to really pull all the levers that's available to the city in really increasing transit, which means NYC Ferry, continuing to work with the MTA on bus planning, including bus route extensions, potentially new bus service through the Hugh L. Carey Tunnel to Lower Manhattan, and also making a commitment to introducing a shuttle as a pilot for connecting residents, existing residents, to subway stations while the MTA is advancing their bus planning. So those are some of the key strategies and goals that we are focusing on through the BMT plan. Next slide. So as I've alluded to, some of the commitments then would be about the strategies that we would be advancing through the next phase of planning. We are making a commitment to studying at least 2 circulation options for achieving the following goals. One is to try to direct truck and car traffic towards the Hamilton Avenue interchange to the BQE rather than Atlantic Avenue, recognizing that Atlantic Avenue intersection is already incredibly congested and hazardous for pedestrians and bicyclists. There are different strategies that we've presented to the task force and in public meetings. For example, forced turns, limiting the kinds of cars and trucks that can even access the site as a way of reducing the overall impacts of trucks and cars on the Atlantic Avenue intersection. There's also a commitment to this $25 million pilot shuttle. The idea is to engage an operator to run an electric shuttle that would then provide better transit access to existing subway stations, and even to potentially pilot the new bus service between BMT and Manhattan through the Hugh L. Carey Tunnel. We would also continue to work with the MTA on increasing bus frequency For example, at the B61 route, creating a priority bus service to really improve its reliability and the frequency for Red Hook and Columbia waterfront residents, as well as extending other routes that are currently being studied through their Brooklyn bus redesign study. And EDC is also committing to increasing NYC ferry service, both at Pier 11 and Pier 6. Currently, that ferry runs about every 50 minutes. Our short-term goal is to reduce that to 40 minutes, with a longer-term goal of increasing that frequency to every 30 minutes. Next slide. We're also committed to continuing to work with DOT in creating a wider, more separated greenway that deconflicts pedestrians, bicyclists, and micromobility distribution vehicles, with the goal of creating a dedicated micro distribution lane, for example, that is separate from the greenway users. We would also be committing to partnering with future developers through future development RFPs and seeking developers who have demonstrated experience in funding and implementing travel demand management strategies, or TDM strategies, that incentivize the use of transit by future residents at BMT. We would also continue to work with DOT in advancing their Reconnecting Communities engagement process, which has looked at opportunities for potentially adding new pedestrian crossings over the capping of the BQE trench, as well as improving safer pedestrian crossings under the elevated BQE. And then we're also committing to studying the feasibility of creating pedestrian priority streets in the districts, including BMT North, Atlantic Basin, and BMT South. That includes the possibility of closing some of the east-west pedestrian connections to vehicles so that it's for pedestrians only, with very limited access to support building operations like sanitation pickups and deliveries. Next slide. Then, with respect to resiliency and climate change, we recognize that the existing neighborhoods are vulnerable to tidal flooding, future sea level rise, and future storm events. And so there's a series of commitments that we're making to make BMT resilient, but also to study future tie-ins that would create a comprehensive flood defense system that would increase climate change adaptation and protection for the entire Red Hook Peninsula. Next slide. So there's a series of commitments for realizing those resiliency goals. We've talked a lot about a comprehensive multi-pronged strategy for integrating resiliency into this mixed-use development and open space infrastructure. So it's a combination of elevating the first grade of buildings, elevating the new marginal pier, and piers supporting the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal. It's elevating the entire site, new streets, and then also investing in building a flood wall that would be integrated with open space and buildings to minimize the impact of that flood wall for residents and public waterfront access. In addition to resiliency, we will continue to work with DEP in their amended drainage planning to make sure that we're preparing for on-site stormwater management practices to be integrated into the project so that stormwater is managed on-site rather than impacting the combined sewer system in the neighborhood. And then really maximizing opportunities for both green infrastructure and gray water infrastructure to, again, minimize those impacts on neighborhood serving infrastructure and not creating more pressures and stress on the surrounding neighborhood. We're also committing to a $5 million study for future flood wall tie-ins that would then create a comprehensive flood protection system for the entire peninsula. And then working also with local businesses and community organizations to minimize the disruption of infrastructure as it's being put into place for BMT. Next slide. With open space, some guiding principles have included making sure that we're designing open spaces that are publicly accessible, that we're creating a combination of destination parks that can support a wider range of active and passive uses, as well as neighborhood parks, activating the Atlantic Basin specifically with a waterfront park around the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, connecting the site with a new greenway, and then integrating resiliency into all those open spaces. And then a new guiding principle that's responsive to task force feedback of really thinking about management models that can ensure the delivery and maintenance of quality open spaces over the long term. Next slide. So in addition to outlining the amount of open space that we will be creating by district, we will also be investing in a mile-long greenway that's connecting the site to Brooklyn Bridge Park and Valentino Park Pier in Red Hook, creating significantly new public waterfront access throughout the entire site, and then committing to working with the community to design and implement open space programming in the next phase. So we believe there's lots of opportunities to support, again, both active and passive recreational uses, and there's opportunities for getting more community impact and really shaping that plan. And then BMTDC, which is this future governance entity, will be responsible for funding the maintenance and operations of that public open space, and then establishing community partnerships to ensure that what is designed and built aligns with community priorities. Next slide. So we'll open it up for Q&A as well.
Great, thanks very much, Jennifer. We've got a number of folks on the call, so encourage folks who haven't shared questions or comments, feel free to, I would encourage you to share. And we'll go to Michael for your specific comment or question.
Good afternoon. My question is about the flood wall, the retaining wall. In a previous call, we had discussed the length of the flood wall, and it was my understanding that the wall would essentially protect the BMT, but not necessarily prevent the redirection of waters in the case of a storm towards the southern area and other parts of Red Hook. So is that still the case? What will where will the retaining wall stop?
Yeah, so that is still the case. And I think what we could do is refer to maybe the resiliency slide in the later portion of this presentation to show visually the extent of the flood wall that would be built at BMT. So if you look at the map here, is that solid orange line, basically from the northern end of Pier 7 at Atlantic Avenue through the length of the BMT site, through the UPS site. And so it would end at the boundary of the UPS site. And then we're committing to a $5 million study to then study the extension of that and the future build out of tie-ins that would then create a flood wall extension that protects the entire peninsula and prevents that back flooding that you described.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate the clarity. I think it's tremendously concerning to hear from a resilience perspective. This is a neighborhood that is, as you all know, extremely impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and we're still living through the impacts of that. I think that having this new neighborhood be built with a consideration for the protection of the BMT and not the rest of the neighborhood is, in my opinion, really unacceptable, and it flies in the face of what this neighborhood is and the fact that this space, like Carolina said earlier, that the neighborhood is being asked to carry a heavy burden. And in this case, the resilience, which has cost quite a bit and has raised over the cost of which has been raised over time, that investment is not being made for the protection of the entirety and the rest of Red Hook. It's really concerning. It's not how this should be. And just want to share that.
I recognize the concern. I would say this is what the BMT project can bear in terms of like what it can finance is this extent. Absent the BMT plan, what you would have instead is the Red Hook Coastal Resiliency Flood Wall built at Atlantic Basin and at Beard Street. And then we would have to look to the city continuing to work with the Army Corps and potentially advancing that HAT study or potentially other studies that have put forward a more comprehensive flood wall defense system and look at other ways of being able to fund that future and more comprehensive flood wall should BMT not move forward.
And I go back to what John, I'll stop right here, but I'll go back to what John has said earlier. The commitment to vote on something that is a one-time payment and not an ongoing offering, especially in this case, that there is no continued commitment outside of a study, a potential study at that, is insufficient. So I'll share that. I think the payment should be ongoing. The commitment to the neighborhood should not be, 4 years and marginal amounts of dollars, while the dollars will continue to come in from the housing over this time. So thank you. Yield my time.
The last thing that I'll say about that is the $5 million commitment to a study of future tie-ins is meaningful because currently the HAT study is prioritizing other elements of the study. The $5 million commitment is an important signal to the Army Corps and to other, agency partners that we are prioritizing Red Hook flood defense system, and would then require their participation in that study to make a concerted effort in advancing that study and the planning work that would then provide the basis for us to raise additional funds for the build out of a more comprehensive system for Red Hook. I recognize that might not be satisfactory, but I just wanted to know that that's why we do think a $5 million commitment to a study is still meaningful, even though it's a study. But it does help fund an important step forward that otherwise would not happen.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Michael. Other questions or comments?
Yes, hello. I had raised my hand. Is it okay to
Yes,
jump
go ahead.
in?
Yes, go ahead. Go to Matthias and then Victoria.
Thank you. Can you guys see me?
More or less, the bottom half of your screen is sort of covered, but okay, there we go.
What about that?
That's perfect.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I wanted to refer to the UPS site and say that from a resiliency perspective, putting 38 floor towers there seems like a total mistake. And that from a transportation perspective, adding 17 housing units stacked up at the far end of a peninsula surrounded in 3 sides by water seems similarly the wrong direction for density for that site in particular. I think there are ways to more housing in Red Hook, spread out, low rise, and I implore for not the first time to consider different ways to do more housing in Red Hook that's sensitive to the challenges of the area, understanding its history in terms of flood and vulnerability to weather impacts. And I want to repeat that the proposal of Friends of Fort Defiance suggests to consider an expanded wetland park with more active flood defense system and compatible industrial uses that address the density and transportation challenges that I was referring to. I know that's more of a comment than a question, but I wanted to share it both with the advisory group members, as I'm sure everyone has seen our proposal reference to in the materials from BMT. And I want to acknowledge the thoughtful incorporation of some of our suggestions and point out the areas where we see a big difference in height and land use on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. Yes, just to quickly summarize, hearing some comments around UPS site in particular and the level of density and comments related to sort of the transportation component and resiliency component, and then the park space along BMT South as well. So I wanted to give a chance for Jennifer or Matt Stout to respond quickly before we go to the next question.
Thanks, Matthias, for your feedback and also for the input that you provided through the proposal that you've put forward. On one hand, as you've noted, we've tried to incorporate as much of that, the Fort Defiance proposal into the UPS site planning in terms of how we're thinking about improving waterfront access, open space, and integrating resiliency into the plan. And so I just want to emphasize from a resiliency perspective that there's a number of steps we would take to, creating a resilient design at UPS. And that includes integrating a 21-foot tall flood wall into the open space and into the new buildings. The overall site would be elevated as well to protect against tidal flooding, future sea level rise, major storm events like a Superstorm Sandy. With respect to transportation, very quickly, again, that's why we're really doubling down on this idea of a combination of strategies, including a shuttle, improving bus route extensions from Red Hook, including Red Hook houses to existing subway stations, really prioritizing the greenway, pedestrian connections, bicycle infrastructure. And then also, one thing that I haven't talked as much about is the strategy of district parking. So it's striking the right balance of not providing an oversupply of parking by not requiring parking minimums, and even going a step further and establishing in the next planning phase parking maximums. And then where we actually provide parking in a few locations that are consolidated and centralized on the BMT site, that we provide the flexibility for that parking to serve different kinds of users. Meaning, if we have a parking facility in Atlantic Basin, for example, for cruise passengers, we can also make some of that parking available, for employees. So it's through a combination of all of those things that we're really trying to prioritize and send a strong signal to both developers and new residents that if you live at BMT, the expectation and the infrastructure that we've designed and built for is for transit use, pedestrians, bicycles, and to really deprioritize and make it inconvenient for people to own cars and use cars at BMT.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Unfortunately, this process with all or nothing doesn't allow some of the nuance that I think understanding how creating additional problems while also putting solutions on the table it could be one step forward, two steps backwards. And I think that part of the clamor of our community for more thoughts, more nuance, and more time to come out with a great result for this process has been so important, because I agree with a lot of the strategies that have been put on the table. Beyond the Dream Park, I've tried to be very proactive. Our team has tried to be very proactive on transportation solutions. But it's unfortunate that the now or never, all or nothing time constraint is putting us in this that really feels like a precipice. And I just want to acknowledge everyone on this process, at least speaking for myself, how stressful has been and how much it's felt both that it's helped surface a lot of the concerns and solutions that we've been asking for a very long time, while also putting us in a now or never, all or nothing moment. And it's carrying that contradiction is what feels like the challenge at this last stretch of the of this week, as the process heads to a vote. And I don't have any recommendations, but I welcome any advice on how to navigate that, because it's a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, thank you. We'll go to Victoria next. What is your specific comment or question?
Well, I wanted to make sure that we had a lot of resiliency comments that we brought in once we were offered the points of agreement to take a look at, and we sent those in, and one of them was on the $5 million study. Red Hook has been studied many times, and it feels very extractive in some ways because of the process that's been set up. And, we want to make sure that you designate who that will be, and it will be somebody that's not reliant on consultants and firms that are reliant on city contracts because it manipulates the outcomes of the findings. So I think that should be independent and so there's accountability to it. And I would hope that you guys could, enforce that in some way into the points of agreement. And we outlined many other resiliency things that we wanted to be considered in this plan, but didn't get the points of agreement sent to us until the 11th hour. So we sent them in, I think, on Tuesday. Because I'm disappointed. I want to just say that the advisory groups were not given opportunities to give feedback, just like the community wasn't given opportunities to give feedback in a meaningful way, like having an email or a form or things that people could fill out that gave feedback on the plan specifically if they had the time and energy to do that. And we were only given an opportunity because a task force member encouraged us to do so. And I just think that that's part of the flawed process that is here. And in taking into account the New York Rising program that actually laid out a really great platform on how to do community engagement in Red Hook, how it's done successfully and how we came up with all the plans and ideas out of that project. So I'd be interested to know is how you guys looked at something that was done well and decided not to repeat it and then not engage on some of the, especially the resiliency things that were outlined that we did the work on after Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand your question, if there's a clear one in there, which is just sort of how we're approaching the resiliency planning in general here. I'm just trying to clarify what unless it's more of a comment.
If you're going to still take the comments that we sent in into consideration around resiliency, because we put a lot of time and energy into that after the fact and scrambled to pull that together through the experts that Red Hook has. Red Hook has a lot of expertise here and has been through firsthand trauma of climate change. And so I would think that you would look back at that and then the planning. How did you take the New York Rising work that you did and put it into this plan would be my one thing. And how, did you look at the community engagement and from that?
Yeah, so no, go ahead. I think
I'm just saying, it's hard to formulate because I'm just on the same, I feel very passionately about exactly what Matthias said, is that this has consumed many people's lives. Made this very stressful for all of us as volunteers and community members that have had to respond in this timeline. And so it's hard to even put into words because I honestly want to cry all the time, just how you've ruined our lives and will continue to do so for the next how many decades. So it's very upsetting to feel like you don't have a seat at a table in your own community, even though I'm at this table.
Heard on that, Victoria. And thank you. Obviously, we're very grateful for the folks that have dedicated so much time to this project and understand that it for some has been stressful. I'd love to still reconnect with you after to make sure that we have all the comments that you've submitted, make sure that the project team has them. But with that, I want to transition us to the last portion on workforce and governance.
Yeah, and maybe as you're transitioning, Chris, I just wanted to also address a few things that Matthias and Victoria sort of alluded to. One is that with the UPS site, the comment about height. So just to provide, I think, some insight about what's sort of driving the towers, and we spoke a bit about this, Matthias, before, but I just wanted to share with the AGs. So there is a tension between the amount of open space and then the height of those buildings. So in our interest in responding to some task force member input that we've heard, we heard a prioritization of increasing the amount of open space. And so the trade-off then is with more open space, then that pushes the buildings higher. But there is the opportunity of, adjusting that so that we bring the height down and we reduce the amount of open space. And when I talk about reducing the amount of open space, it might be from 7 acres to 5 acres, for example. So I wanted to note that, and the opportunity for, post task force vote, there being opportunities for more task force input and public engagement in the next phase of planning. And that's something that Mikhail will be able to talk a little bit more about when we talk about governance. So with that, I'll transition to Mikhail.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we're going to start by talking about workforce development. I know that was a question earlier this afternoon. And I know that we have had task force meeting, an advisory group meeting where we talked about workforce in particular with the workforce focused AG. So appreciate all of the really meaningful comments that we've received on this front. So in terms of guiding principles, what we've heard is that it's important to make construction jobs accessible to the local community and ensure that all community members have access to future jobs at BMT with a focus on connecting unemployed and underemployed local residents to jobs and creating jobs with family sustaining wages. So two really essential principles and then a series of commitments to reflect that. So in the site plan, we have reserved a minimum of 15,000 square feet of space at Atlantic Basin, and we have committed $17 million towards the design and construction of that space for a Maritime Port and Blue Highway welcome and experiential learning center that includes workforce training space. And that build out will be complemented by $12 million towards workforce development that also includes bridge and adult education programming. We've also committed to identifying operators to manage that learning center and other Blue Highways initiatives, focusing on an operator for the Red Hook Economic Mobility Network, which will establish a coalition of workforce partners. This is something that we have done recently announced in Sunset Park, which is essentially building capacity for existing workforce providers and organizations so that they can support improving access to jobs, particularly for local residents, things like apprenticeships, internships, both for BMT and the Blue Highway. We've heard a lot about collaborating with local existing expertise in education. And so that is a component of this as well. And then as we've heard from NYCHA residents and TA leadership in particular, focused on maritime degree scholarships for young adults at NYCHA, and then expanding access to residents, not just at the Red Hook houses, but also broader CB6. So this would include Gowanus and Whitecoff, and supporting a dedicated pipeline to jobs at BMT. We've also committed to applying the city's community hiring program to BMT tenants. So this includes, not only identification of community hires, but also reporting and accountability on how these investments are supporting local job creation. We have also committed to a project labor agreement for the city-funded capital construction and working closely with the union on workforce goals. And then lastly, this is a bit more broader that we've touched on and is, targeted workforce strategies for underemployed and unemployed local residents. So those are the commitments on the workforce side. And we can go to the next slide, please. And then we want to talk about governance. And obviously this has come up a lot as part of this conversation, as part of previous conversations, is one, how can we, be certain that the commitments that are being discussed will actually be followed through on? How do you ensure that if the task force does vote yes on this vision plan, that what they have voted on is actually what will be implemented? And we received a lot of feedback from the task force and from many of the folks on the call today about what a sustainable governance structure looks like. And so we're thinking about this within two sort of distinct timeframes. The first one is pre-GPP approval. So this again assumes that we have an approved site plan, and then we would immediately stand up an advisory task force, which would have the initial purpose of advising and guiding the site plan through the environmental review and the duration of the GPP process. So that means continued stakeholder engagement after the plan has been voted on. The second stage would be post GPP approval. And so what is in front of the task force now is the proposal to create a local development corporation, the BMTDC, Brooklyn Marine Terminal Development Corporation, that would be formed by the end of this year and will have board representation from the city, the state, and local officials. So this is, John, I think you referenced Battery Park City Authority earlier on the call. Folks are very familiar with Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation. So somewhat similar models, but essentially this entity would have the financial responsibility for the operation and the development of the BMT site, including approving the contracts and leases. And then in addition to the development corporation, similar to what was stood up in Gowanus, we would see the creation of an oversight task force. So after GPP approval, the oversight task force would continue to act as an advisory entity to ensure that there's continued community feedback and a place to send progress reports regarding the site development, the implementation of the commitments, and the follow through of the vision plan. So again, BMT task force that is in place now, a new advisory task force during GPP, and then at the end of the process, development corporation and oversight task force that would be charged with implementation. And we can go to the next slide. So in terms of how this gets broken out for the guiding principles and for the commitments. The first is ensuring that from a governance perspective, there's adherence to the final vision plan, that this advisory task force is ensuring transparency and accountability, as well as project commitment tracking. Ensuring the long-term financial sustainability of the marine terminal is a critical component of this, as well as implementing the project through a phased approach so that community benefits are being delivered in tandem with the mixed use developments. So that means, as we are going through, they are happening hand in hand. And then, as I mentioned with the development corporation, this would be a separate single purpose entity to manage the project's implementation. And then on the commitments, again, just to break out what I highlighted earlier, prior to GPP approval, the advisory task force being stood up, this task force would meet monthly. After GPP approval, we have committed to having an outside third-party facilitator to fund this advisory task force, basically until project revenues start coming in, and that is to support the independence of this advisory task force and help with capacity on reviewing these commitments. Working to establish the Brooklyn Marine Terminal Development Corporation by the end of the year. And then we've also committed that appointees to the board will be selected based on a variety of factors. So yes, experience with port operations and industrial development, open space management, but also a focus on appointing members from the existing adjacent neighborhoods so that there's very clear local representation. We also have committed to funding third-party legal review of the entity documents so that the advisory task force is able to have meaningful input on the creation and bylaws and governance processes for the development corporation. And that input is, supported by legal expertise prior to their adoption. And I think that might be the last slide on this one. So in terms of, what would this development corporation be doing? Yes, it's establishing bylaws and governance procedures, having leadership, including an executive director, negotiating a defined service agreement to support its work, advising on the environmental review and GPP, and then developing a very clear process for implementing the commitments that we've discussed. BMTDC will also be responsible for releasing RFPs. And one of the things that we've heard from the task force is that, you know, this should be sought from multiple developers rather than a single developer, so that we're supporting project delivery, reducing risk, and fostering competitive bidding. I've mentioned this, but again, to reinforce that it is the development corporation that would have final responsibility for operation, issuing the RFPs, and enforcing all of the contracts between the site developers and the operators. So sort of, Catherine, to your question of like who would be responsible for ensuring that, you know, the open space is delivered, or, you know, whatever the commitment is, it will be the development corporation who has that final responsibility and all of the, you know, contracting mechanisms that allows. And we can now open it up to questions.
Great, thank you, Mikkel. Yes, opening it up to specific questions and comments on the workforce and governance components. John, I see your hand. Go ahead. And then Catherine.
On one of your presentations, they had a breakdown, right? So it was board seats 21, mayoral appointees 11, ex officio 4 of them, OMB, FDM, EDC, HPD, mayoral 7, including a chairperson, gubernatorial appointees 5, local electeds 5, the Brooklyn Borough President, the City Council Speaker, State Assembly Speaker, State Senate Majority Leader, and the Congressman. There's only one local person on that, which is the Borough President. Only one. Like
so John, in the time since that was first presented, that has been updated to include representation from Community Board 6, as well as a commitment that those appointees include people who live adjacent to the marine terminal. So it would be more than just one. There's also a confirmed seat for a resident of Red Hook houses. So there would be robust local representation.
You see why you guys aren't trusted? Because who would even think of this to initiate this, to even bring this up? And if nobody brings it up, then, you know, we have no local say. Like, that's insane. I'll just say that. Thank you.
Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I did put that same question in the chat, just about if you could share in writing what the current breakdown is, then that would be helpful before the end of the call. And then I'm just wondering, thank you for clarifying that the BMTDC is accountable for ensuring that the commitments are made. But like, what's the process if the commitments are not made? Like, what happens?
Yeah, so that is essentially what the development corporation would be responsible for determining as they're setting up their bylaws. So we're not trying to be prescriptive on this future entity over what types of penalties or, you know, contract breaks or what would happen. And that is part of the reason why the advisory task force will be supporting having those bylaws and structures set up, that would have that third party legal review to support that, so that, you know, input on what those mechanisms would come before the final bylaws and mission statement and all of that is laid out.
So I guess my question is just like, for task force members on the call, like, how do you vote on a plan if you don't know how the plan will be upheld? So like, we have the commitments in this presentation, we don't have any security. So if I was a task force member, I'd be like, I can't even vote on this because I don't even know what the teeth are. So I'm just wondering, I don't know if anyone's able to share the thinking on that. If you could clarify.
Yeah, so the question here is sort of obviously there's a goal and intention for the development corporation to sort of support and ensure that the commitments are upheld. I guess there's an open ask to any task force members who want to share their thoughts on how they're thinking about that specific piece as we get to the final phase of the planning process here. Or if David Lowen, if you want to sort of share from your experience with Brooklyn Bridge Park and in other instances.
David, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks, Chris. So I think a lot of this concern we should acknowledge is coming from the recent experience we've had, everyone's had with the Atlantic Yards situation and the perceived lack of enforcement on regulations there. I think, look, it's on some level, the best thing that we can do to ensure enforcement is to ensure that we have a locally based project specific entity that is overseeing this project, which is what we are proposing with the BMTDC. And although people have mentioned, I've seen in the comments, concerns with this entity being ultimately controlled by the mayor, I think it is important to note that that mayoral control is similar to any local development corporation such as this, where the city is putting in so many of the resources, whether it's through the capital budget or through the transferring of land value or pilot value. It should be expected that that the entity that puts in all those resources would want to ultimately retain control. But it's also important not to minimize what happens when you have local elected officials on the board or with representation, whether that is the council members or the state assembly or Congress or state Senate members who do provide that that insight into the inner mechanisms of the board and the ability to speak at the board meetings with any local concerns. At the end of the day, there are several ways to ensure compliance with this. Many of the points of agreement and the commitments that we are making will be embedded in the GPP and will therefore be embedded into the land use controls. And so they will need to be developed that way in order to comply with appropriate land use. And any deviation from those land use controls would require a modification of the GPP, which has a whole other public process associated with it. We'll need to go back to ESDC, and we need to have additional public hearings and environmental review. Those commitments that are happening outside of the land use control are also, would be in the control of the BMTDC. Those are essentially, at the end of the day, really consist of spending funds that are collected through the land use control, so that the BMTDC board would be the ultimate arbiter of how to spend those funds, and to ensure that they are spending those funds in compliance with the points of agreement. We would have the oversight task force that would be meeting regularly and would be reported to by the BMTDC to show compliance with those commitments at the end of the day.
Thanks, David.
Ask one question that was helpful. I'm just trying to understand how this is a local entity. Are you defining it as a local entity because of the 6 local representatives? Or is that like the city council member? And because I see that it's city council speaker, assembly speaker, but not our, like, how are you defining it as local?
Yeah, so by local, so part of what I mean by local is that it's a project specific, that it is not living within a larger organization that has other concerns, but that is only concerned with this specific project. And the other thing I mean is, yes, although the many of the representations are made by the speakers, whether it's the Speaker of the House or the Assembly or the Senate, in actuality, similar to what happens with ULURP, with the land use process, we find that there is deference to the local member. And so, for example, in Brooklyn Bridge Park, there's a similar situation where the city council speaker, officially the seat belongs to the city council speaker, but when it comes to nominating that representative, they defer to the local city council member to do it. And we would expect that to continue here. We do currently cross a couple of council districts, and I think assembly districts as well. And so it would be up to the speaker to defer to them to choose the appropriate representative.
Thanks, David. I want to get to Carolina before we move to the environmental review section. So Carolina, go ahead, your specific question or comment.
Yes, I'm following up on John Leva's comment about, local representation. So, according to Portside's new story map, and I'll put the link in, the chat shortly, there are 15,945 people, or 16,000 people living in the BMT area, and 7,641 in NYCHA. Now, I know the census generally undercounts NYCHA. I don't know, maybe Catherine, you can weigh in, or Michael Lopez, as to how much more you think are really living in there. But I'm mentioning that because if there's no representation for people living in private housing, either in Red Hook or in the Columbia Waterfront District, that is, more than half the local area population, which doesn't have representation. And I just want to bring that up because we now have the statistics thanks to this project. And I want to state that I think it's very important to help NYCHA. I think we are overdue as a society to fix many things in NYCHA. We have done wrong by those people. So that is not to take away in any way from the importance of NYCHA. But I do think there's an imbalance in the representation here in terms of residents, to not include residents in private housing. The other thing I learned at the story map, to my surprise, was to find out how many people are actually in Red Hook still living in rental housing. So it's not primarily a home ownership community. It's a rental community. And I agree with the comments that others have made that they're at risk of displacement by the gentrification that the introduction of a large amount of luxury housing always ends up doing. And also there's the risk of all the industrial businesses because Red Hook is a mixed-use neighborhood, that they get gentrified out. But I think there really needs to be much better representation, more equitable statistically, to include people who are not in NYCHA. Again, not trying to take anything away from NYCHA, but
Heard on your feedback in terms of representation, Carolina. Thank you. John, please go ahead.
So the way we're voting, right? They're gonna vote, which we, the community, overwhelmingly is against this and urges all task force members to vote no, and then we can do this right. But let's just say it goes along, right? Why not? Because we say all this is aspirational guidelines, and we're hoping and we're wishing. I have a lot of hopes and dreams too, right? But why don't you just put the GPP that you're going to put out, that document, and let people vote on the document itself, and not the aspirations, not presentations, not pictures, but the actual document and what it's going to say in black and white, so they can vote knowing that it's really something on paper and not your interpretation of it.
John, that's a great transition into the next section where we talk about what the environmental review and GP process is. So I think invite Mikkel to come back on to walk us through that section.
Sure. And just to take a step back, John, because I do understand the question in terms of like a sequencing perspective, but to be clear, the reason why there is a task force that was created, an engagement and planning timeline that has obviously been very iterative with the task force, was because the task force leadership, the congressman, the senator, and the council member did not want a scenario where an environmental review and a general project plan proposal was like developed without this task force doing a review and a vote to approve it moving ahead. So yes, there is sort of one alternative timeline, right, where there was just a proposal that EDC put together and, tried to take that through GPP, but it was very important to the leadership. And I think, many of you heard this from the senator at his town hall on Monday night, that it was important that there be an opportunity to have these difficult discussions about all of these different uses and state that would be deliberated on and ultimately voted on before moving to that next step. So that's why that approach was taken. But we can go to the next slide, and then return back for additional questions. So just on the timeline, I highlighted this when speaking about governance. Again, the current task force is set to vote on June 18th. And then that task force, they're essentially will sunset. You know, the original ask of them was to be part of this engagement and planning process, and then to vote yes or no on the final vision plan. So they will do that by June 18th. That work will sunset, and then if they, vote in the affirmative, then the next step would be the creation of the advisory task force that I referenced, that would be supporting throughout the EIS process. We would be, coming back with stakeholder engagement as early as August to talk about this draft scope of work. There would be a public hearing in September for the scoping hearing. And again, that development corporation would be established by the end of 2025. And then going into 2026 would be the continuation of environmental review, public hearing. As we've talked about in previous conversations, GPPs also go to the City Planning Commission. So that would happen by spring 2026. And by the summer of 2026 would be the transition to that oversight task force that we referenced. And all of that is leading towards the goal of having the Development Corporation release the first RFP, the Port RFP, by the winter of 2026. So that obviously is a very high level timeline, but I know we've received a lot of questions about what does engagement look like post vote, what is the process for the stakeholders to continue to provide feedback. And this is obviously a very high level outline that includes continued community engagement.
Great. Thanks very much, Mikkel. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to end by talking through the remaining touch points. So this is sort of the last engagement with the advisory group. So I think it's worth sort of just talking through the fact that initially we were only going to meet 3 times. Obviously that expanded. We had added 2 opportunities for the, all the AGs to come together, as well as additional individual meetings. But the future engagements before the June 18th vote will include a hybrid workshop on Monday, June 9th at the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, 6 to 8. Folks can join in person or virtually. And then following that public workshop, there'll be a series of info sessions and engagements on June 10th, 11th, and 12th. Those will be hosted at the Red Hook Arts Project and the Carroll Gardens Association. So, we invite you to sort of spread the word. We're hoping to engage as many folks as we can in these remaining weeks. But yeah, I think that is our meeting for today. We really appreciate everyone's time and commitment throughout this process. So thank you.
I think that everybody on the task force got an email from us today inviting them to a meeting tonight at New Brown Church. I hope that to see some of the task force and advisory group meetings there. We handed out flyers for this meeting tonight, and many people in the neighborhood did not know this was happening. So putting my 2 cents in there before it gets shut down. Okay.
Thanks, Victoria. And I just want to make one point. So there was a question in the chat about what exactly will the task force be voting on. And just to be clear, the guiding principles that we shared today, the commitments that we shared today, and the site plan, that is the package that they will be voting on June 18th. And so in addition to the engagement event that Victoria highlighted, as well as the meetings that we laid out next week, that is really the opportunity to, I should say EDC's meetings next week are the opportunity for us to share what we shared with you all today, so that folks are clear on what exactly the task force is voting on.
But guiding principles are all subject to change, right?
Yes.
No, so they would be voting on those guiding principles. So if they vote yes, like those are the guiding principles for the project.
And none of them will change. They're not subject to change.
No, this is what is in front of the task force now. So
No,
there
it's
could
not-
be
not-
change.
it's
Maybe
not
I'm not understanding.
Don't
We're still
understand.
in discussion with the task force now about the vision plan. So there may be edits and clarifications, but once it is voted on, it's not subject to change.
But it's subject to change over time because GPP changes over time.
Well, and David can speak more to this, but the process to modify a GPP is a very sort of detailed and technical one.
Please, I'd love to hear from David. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, and not to be snippy, but everything changes over time, Victoria, right? I mean, and I think, and I don't think it's I think one of the things that I'm hearing in some of these comments that I want to push back on a little bit is,
Your lips don't change.
is the idea that, John, if you can let me finish, that'd be great.
Your lips
Is
don't
that
change, correct?
you can stop interrupting me and then I can finish, John.
No, your lips don't change, right?
John, please
Can
be
you answer that
respectful to
question?
everyone
Your lips
else on the
change.
call by stop interrupting me and letting me answer the question. Thank you.
Do your lips change?
I said, please stop. Thank you.
I'd love to hear from
The
David.
planning process is, I think there's a misperception about the planning process that the vote on June 18th represents the end of planning, right? Projects like these are long and complicated, and it would be foolish for everyone to think that we were going to plan everything perfectly between the time that we started last September and June 18th. The planning is going to be ongoing. There are going to be further refinements that happen during the GPP process, and then there are going to be further refinements that happen after the GPP process. Like, let's not pretend that this is the
Does
end of
that
a
happen with a
process
YOLO?
that gets set in stone, right?
Does that happen
And
with a YOLO?
John, if I have to have you muted, I will.
I'm asking you a question.
John, let me finish my answer.
But I'm asking you a
Let
question.
me
Dave.
finish my answer. Thank you. So, in the Brooklyn Bridge Park project, of which I was a member for 15 years, the project changed over time continuously. And all that you can really show is that there's continued reporting and transparency, and that there are community advisory committees, there are public board members that hold everyone accountable. But I think perceiving this as something that's going to get written in stone and be delivered by Moses down from Sinai today and will never change, that's not how it's going to happen,
Do
right?
your lips change?
So
Do
I
ULIPs
think
change?
that's, I
ULIPs
think
can be brought to change, yes.
After they're
You-
already
They
done?
can be rezoned afterwards. In the
Well,
same
that's
way
a
that a
whole new
GPP can
process
be
again.
modified. There's a process that requires EIS, it requires approval from public entities, and it requires public hearings, and then they can change. That is
Sounds
the
like
same
a
for
heavy lift.
ULIPs, that is
Sounds
the
like a
same for
whole new process.
GPPs, that is the same for all zoning.
Excuse me to both David and John, if you could pause for just one moment. Victoria, if you can make your comment and we're going to end the meeting. Thank you.
It's not a comment. I just want to know, I put it in the chat, how can there be meaningful feedback from the advisory groups? We're not meeting, we haven't met in 2 months in our group. I scrambled to get some comments together, but it doesn't seem there's the feedback loop is missing here. The reason we're on the advisory groups is supposed to be able to get feedback, but there doesn't seem to be a way besides, this meeting for us to actually do this. And this isn't a constructive way to get feedback in a meeting of 60 some odd people.
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, I would just want to reemphasize that we expanded the role of the advisory group. So we expanded the number of meetings, we added more opportunities for everyone to come together. And so we've been taking that feedback to the task force. We also invited the task force to listen in on meetings directly so they could hear directly from advisory group members. So I don't want to, I think it's not a fair characterization to say that there hasn't been a feedback loop.
No, but
Victoria, let me finish, please. What we wanted to do with this,
my question to you,
what we wanted to do with this meeting was present the vision plan where it stands today and provide an opportunity for folks to give feedback through discussion. And that's what happened. That's what happened today.
Right. So, but all of the feedback has been through discussion. There hasn't been a way for us to, as technical people, be able to look at papers and look at reports and give feedback on data and other things. The only feedback loop that's been created is through these meetings. And how can we give, this is not a space for meaningful feedback. So what space has been created or can be created before the vote to give meaningful feedback from the advisory group members?
I hear you on your frustration around the mechanism for which we're collecting feedback, but we're not creating a mechanism where advisory group members are giving line edits or direct feedback on text, where that's not a part of the advisory group structure. And I understand that may not be satisfactory to you, but I just want to be transparent around what our process is. So thank you,
What
everyone,
others
for
asking all
joining.
advisory
We're-
groups if they
we're-
feel that they've had any meaningful dialogue in this. Go ahead. I dare you.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for joining. We're going to close the meeting now. Thank you.
Jacqueline, call me later. Bye, Jacqueline.